It's truly remarkable watching these large language models evolve. I mean, really.
It is pretty amazing.
We've seen them go from, just generating coherent text to tackling surprisingly complex reasoning tasks.
Yeah.
I'm talking about things like solving intricate math problems, generating functional code, even showing some, well, nascent visual reasoning.
Right. It feels like a huge leap.
It really does. It feels like they're not just repeating patterns anymore, but like genuinely processing information in new ways.
And that sense of progress, it's definitely compelling. And it's often attributed, especially in these really demanding reasoning areas, to a training technique called reinforcement learning with verifiable rewards, RLVR.
Right, RLVR. Yeah,
And
and the intuition makes sense, doesn't it? You sort of treat the LLM like an agent learning.
exactly. In an
Yeah, you
environment.
give it a problem, it produces an output. If that output is correct, like say the code compiles and passes test, or the math solution is right, you give it a positive reward.
Mm,
And the model then learns to adjust its internal workings to favor generating outputs that lead to those verifiable rewards.
exactly right. And the common belief, the sort of narrative out there, is that through this iterative reward-driven process, RLVR lets LLMs continuously improve their reasoning skills.
Right.
Maybe even discover entirely new strategies or approaches to problems that weren't explicitly in their initial training data.
Ah.
So it suggests RLVR is like a key ingredient for pushing models beyond their initial capabilities, kind of enabling self-improvement in reasoning.
And that's the really exciting part, isn't it? That idea that they could like explore the problem space and find novel, more effective ways of thinking.
Yeah.
Much like, a reinforcement learning agent learning to master Go or something, discovering strategies no human even thought of.
That is indeed the powerful vision.
Yeah.
It's often associated with RLVR's success in these areas.
Yeah.
It implies the training is genuinely, expanding the model's fundamental reasoning capacity.
But, and this is why you're doing this deep dive today, we've gotten our hands on a really fascinating, maybe slightly provocative recent research paper. And it takes a very rigorous look at this widely held belief. And, well, its findings really challenge that notion that current RLVR methods are achieving this kind of fundamental reasoning breakthrough.
Yeah, what makes this paper stand out, I think, is that it doesn't just measure whether RLVR improves performance, which, let's be clear, it clearly does on standard metrics like accuracy.
Right.
But it asks a deeper, maybe more fundamental question. Does current RLVR training truly equip LLMs with novel reasoning abilities? Enabling them to explore and discover new problem-solving strategies? Or is it primarily doing something subtly but, well, significantly different?
Okay, and what is that something different they're hypothesizing?
Well, the paper investigates whether RLVR might largely be optimizing the use of reasoning patterns that were already present.
Already there.
Yeah, already there, albeit perhaps less accessible or, less probable in the base model before the RLVR training even started.
Okay. Let's really unpack this. This is the core idea, right? So the conventional wisdom we hear about models like, say, OpenAI o1 or DeepSeek R1, they're known for strong reasoning, is that their RLVR fine-tuning is what really elevates them, like dramatically beyond their initial base models.
Right. The story is RL better reasoning.
Yeah, the assumption is that the RL process helps them climb to some new level of intelligence, maybe exploring novel algorithmic paths or logical steps they wouldn't have found otherwise.
That's the narrative, exactly. RLVR is an engine for discovering new reasoning frontiers. It's a very intuitive parallel to how RL achieved, superhuman performance in games.
Right, where the agents learn completely new strategies through trial and error and reward.
Precisely. But this paper suggests that maybe, just maybe, that's not quite what's happening with current RLVR approaches on LLMs, at least not the way we usually think about novel discovery. So, to test this hypothesis rigorously, they realized that simply measuring average accuracy, like pass at 1, isn't really enough.
Pass at 1, that's like just the first answer it gives.
Yeah, average accuracy tells you how often the model gets the answer right on its first try, or its most likely output. But it doesn't tell you the full story of the model's potential to solve a problem.
Okay, this is where they bring in this key metric that's like crucial for understanding their findings. Pass at K.
Yes, pass at K, exactly. It's a metric that I think it originated in evaluating code generation,
Makes sense.
where a model might propose several possible code solutions. Instead of just looking at the best one, pass at K looks at whether any of the top K generated samples are correct.
So if you ask the model to solve a math problem, you don't just look at the very first answer. You might say, okay, give me 10 possible ways to solve this, or generate 10 different potential solutions.
Hmm.
Pass at 10 would then measure if at least one of those 10 attempts was actually correct.
That's exactly right. If even 1 out of k samples for a given problem is correct, the model successfully solves that problem at pass at k. It's designed to probe the model's underlying capability.
Okay.
Does the model possess the knowledge or ability to solve this problem at all if you give it multiple attempts?
Okay. So why is looking at pass at k, especially for large values of k, why is that so important for this study, for figuring out if RLVR creates novel reasoning?
Well, because traditional metrics like pass at 1 can significantly underestimate a model's true reasoning capacity. Think of it like this.
Yeah.
A model might actually know how to solve a difficult problem, and maybe occasionally it even produces the correct step-by-step reasoning, but perhaps its internal probability distribution just makes other incorrect paths more likely on the first try.
Ah,
So
okay.
pass at 1 would count that as a failure. But if you let it generate multiple attempts, a large K, and one of those attempts is correct, pass at K reveals that the underlying capability was actually present in the model all along. So by looking at pass at K for large K, and they tested up to K256 in some cases, which is a lot of samples, you get a much more robust measure of the sort of boundary of what the model is potentially capable of solving, given enough chances.
Ah, okay, got it. So tasks at k at large k gives you a better picture of the outer limits of the model's reasoning abilities. Can it ever get there, even if it's not its most probable output?
Precisely. That's the idea. And they applied this rigorous approach across a whole variety of reasoning tasks, math, coding, even tasks involving visual reasoning descriptions.
Wow, okay.
Using different foundational models too, like Qwen 2.5 and Lamy 3.1, fine-tuned with RLVR and standard benchmarks, just to make sure their findings weren't, specific to one narrow area or model.
Right, robust. Okay, so they have this powerful tool in PassAtK to measure potential. What did they actually find? When they turn this lens onto RLVR trained models compared to their base models, this is where it gets really interesting, right?
This is indeed the surprising part.
Oh,
Yeah, the core finding is really counterintuitive to that conventional wisdom we talked about.
okay.
While they confirm that RLVR trained models do consistently outperform their base models at small values of K,
Like K1.
particularly K1, exactly, which is why they score higher on standard accuracy benchmarks, right? Makes sense.
Uh-huh.
But they found the opposite trend when looking at large values of K.
Wait, hang on. Are you saying the base model, like the one before any RLVR training, it actually has a higher potential capacity?
Exactly what their extensive results suggest.
See that?
Across nearly all the tasks and models they tested, the base models consistently surpassed the RLVR trained models in the pass at K-score when K was large enough.
Wow.
If you look at the curves they plot in the paper, like in Figure 2 for math benchmarks or Figure 4 for coding and visual reasoning,
Yeah.
you see this consistent pattern. The RLVR model's curve, it starts higher and climbs quickly.
Better pass at 1, better sampling efficiency.
Exactly. Great sampling efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
But the base model's curve, while maybe starting lower, it continues to rise more steeply at higher K values.
Right.
And eventually it crosses over and ends up significantly higher at large K.
So the base model, it might not be as good at putting the right answer first, but it has a broader range of problems it can actually solve if you explore its possibilities more. It has a wider landscape of potential solutions.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
The base model demonstrates a broader coverage of solvable problems. Its potential reasoning capacity, the frontier of what it's capable of achieving, if you could somehow explore its output space comprehensively, it appears wider than that of the model after it's been specifically trained with RLVR.
Huh.
The RLVR training seems to make the model much better at navigating its existing potential to find the correct answer quickly,
Okay.
but it doesn't seem to expand that potential itself, if anything.
That's genuinely surprising. I mean, it really flips the script on how we might think about what RLVR is actually doing, and I think they saw an even more, maybe, concerning trend as the RLVR training progressed.
Yes, that was another striking observation. They found that as the RLVR training continues, even while the pass at 1 score keeps improving, indicating better efficiency, the model's pass at K performance at large, K often plateaus
Okay.
or even decreases.
It gets worse at solving problems it could have solved earlier in training.
Exactly. The reasoning capability boundary, as they measure it with pass at K at large K, it appears to narrow during the RLVR training process.
Wow.
You can see this pattern when they compare different training checkpoints. It's illustrated in Figure 1, right, in the paper, and detailed in tables like Table 3 for specific benchmarks. The training optimizes for giving the correct answer on the first try.
Right.
And in doing so, it might inadvertently reduce the model's ability to find correct answers among multiple tries for a wider range of problems.
That really suggests RLVR isn't just failing to expand the boundary. It might actually be like pruning some of the potential capabilities that were there in the initial base model.
That interpretation definitely aligns with the data.
Yeah. So to understand why this might be happening, they looked really closely at the actual reasoning paths generated by the models.
That's step-by-step thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are the RLVR models finding new ways to solve problems, or are they just getting better at executing existing ones?
And what did that analysis show?
Well, they use techniques like perplexity analysis and coverage analysis, basically comparing the step-by-step reasoning generated by the RLVR models to what the base models could generate.
Okay.
And figures like Figure 6, which shows perplexity, and tables 4 and 5 on coverage, they showed a really consistent pattern. The successful reasoning paths generated by the RLVR models are highly likely, often overwhelmingly so, to be paths that the base model could already generate.
So RLVR isn't generating fundamentally new sequences of thoughts or steps. It's just making the sequences that already existed in the base model and happen to be successful much more probable. That's the strong conclusion drawn from this analysis, yeah. The set of problems that the RLVR model can solve, particularly at large K, is often effectively a subset of the problems solvable by the base model.
A subset. Oh.
It's reinforcing the probability of successful paths within the base model's existing distribution of possible outputs, not really exploring or creating paths outside of it.
Okay.
And they showed this in another way, too, with the accuracy distribution analysis in Figure 5. RLVR increased the number of problems solved with very high accuracy, which is good,
Right.
but it also increased the number of problems with zero accuracy, meaning some problems became entirely unsolvable for the RLVR model.
This paints a very, very different picture. RLVR sounds less like an explorer discovering new lands of reasoning
Yeah.
and more like a highly efficient optimizer, just making the model better at navigating the map it already had.
That's a really good analogy. It's dramatically boosting sampling efficiency, making the right path more likely to appear early. But it's not necessarily redrawing the map or adding new territory. And the paper contrasts this explicitly with other techniques, like distillation.
Right, distillation. How does that compare in this context?
Well, distillation is where you train a model, usually a smaller one, to mimic the outputs of a larger, often stronger teacher model.
Okay.
And that process can involve transferring knowledge and reasoning patterns from the teacher to the student model. And the paper found that unlike current RLVR, distillation can actually introduce genuinely new reasoning patterns to the student model.
New patterns.
Yeah, patterns that weren't present in its base version. And it can expand the reasoning boundary beyond the base model's initial capacity.
So a smaller model, learning from a bigger, smarter model, can gain new capabilities, but a model seemingly learning from its own successes via RLVR doesn't seem to.
That's what this data strongly suggests, yes. Figure 7 in the paper shows a clear example where the distilled model's pass at K-curve lies significantly above the base model's curve across the board.
Indicating an actual expansion of capacity.
Exactly. And this comparison really serves to highlight the specific limitation they observed in these current RLVR approaches.
It really underscores that RLVR, at least as it's currently applied, might be fundamentally different from other ways models can acquire or improve capabilities. Did they look at whether using a different type of RL algorithm made a difference? I mean, there are lots of variations out there, right? PPO and others.
They did. Yeah, they tested several prominent policy gradient methods. PPO, GOPO, Reinforce plus RO, Remax, DAPO, a whole list.
Okay.
And their findings, shown in Figure 8 and Table 2, indicated that while these algorithms varied a bit in how effectively they improved sampling efficiency, the pass it won.
Right.
They all exhibited similar behavior in terms of failing to expand and often reducing the reasoning capacity at large.
Joe, none of them really cracked it.
None of them seemed to.
Yeah.
They all remained far from optimally leveraging the base model's full potential capacity, as measured by something like pass at 256.
So it's not about just picking the right current RL algorithm. It seems to be maybe a limitation of the overall paradigm for this specific application.
That appears to be the case, based on this evidence. They also investigated other factors, like the observation that RL training often leads to reduced output entropy.
Meaning the model's outputs become less diverse, More predictable.
Exactly. Less diverse. And while this reduction in diversity likely contributes to the narrowing boundary, it makes sense, right? Less exploration.
Yeah.
Figure 17 showed that even when they tried to account for or match the entropy levels, the RLVR model still significantly underperformed the base models at large in K. So entropy reduction is part of the story, but not the whole explanation.
Okay. So this brings us back to the really big question then. Why?
Mm.
Why is current RLVR for LLMs behaving this way? Why isn't it leading to that genuine exploration and novel strategy discovery we see in other RL applications like, game-playing agents, AlphaGo?
Well, the paper points to two major factors that really differentiate RL on LLMs from those traditional RL successes. The first one is just the sheer scale of the action space.
The action space.
Yeah.
You mean the number of possible words or tokens the model can output at any given step?
Exactly. Think about it. In a game like Go or chess, the number of possible moves from any state is large, sure, but it's finite. It's manageable.
Right.
In language, the action space is the entire vocabulary, potentially tens of thousands of tokens at every single token position. Exploring this astronomically vast space randomly to find novel, coherent reasoning paths that just happen to lead to a verifiable reward. It's incredibly difficult, maybe practically impossible with current methods.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. The exploration challenge is just immense. What's the second factor?
The second and arguably more crucial factor is the use of a pre-trained prior.
The base language model itself.
Right. Unlike training an agent from absolute scratch, RLVR on LLMs starts with a model that already has incredibly powerful language generation abilities. It implicitly knows a vast amount about reasoning patterns it saw in its massive training data.
And that pre-trained prior? That's the double-edged sword you mentioned earlier?
Precisely. That's how they frame it. On one hand, it's absolutely essential for RLVR to even work at all in this vast language space.
How so?
Well, the base model's prior distribution over tokens allows it to generate outputs that are, linguistically coherent and likely to be relevant to the problem. It makes it possible to even stumble upon successful path and receive rewards in the first place.
Okay.
Without that guidance from the prior, the model would just be generating random noise, basically gibberish, during its exploration. You'd never get a reward.
Right, okay. So it helps guide the search, but how does it constrain novelty then? What's the downside?
The downside is that the policy gradient methods commonly used in RLVR primarily work by increasing the probability of actions, token sequences, that led to positive rewards within the existing probability distribution defined by that base model's prior. The training reinforces the successful paths that were already, somewhat likely, or at least plausible, according to the base model. It effectively optimizes within the landscape of probabilities provided by the base model's initial understanding.
Okay.
It doesn't really effectively incentivize or facilitate exploration into regions of that vast language space that are very low probability, according to the base model.
Right.
But which hypothetically might contain fundamentally new and maybe even more effective reasoning strategies.
So it's like finding the most efficient highways on the map you already have, rather than venturing off-road to discover entirely new terrain.
That's a very apt analogy.
Yeah.
The paper argues that current RLVR, while it's excellent at optimizing travel within that existing map, hasn't yet cracked the code on how to genuinely explore and exploit the potential for novel reasoning that might lie outside of, or is just a very low probability within the base model's initial distribution.
Which means, essentially, it's not truly unlocking RL's famed potential for discovering new algorithms or strategies in this context.
Not yet, I see.
But rather refining the execution of existing ones. So, given these findings, what does the paper suggest for the future? How do we get towards developing truly novel reasoning in LLMs?
Well, they conclude that new paradigms are likely needed. This includes developing improved RL algorithms, maybe ones specifically designed for the challenges of this huge language action space and the presence of that strong pre-trained prior.
Makes sense.
Crucially, they emphasize the need for much better exploration strategies, ways to push the model beyond just optimizing the existing distribution. They also highlight the potential of incorporating things like multi-turn agent environment interactions, allowing the model to generate sequences of actions and learn from the intermediate results and final outcomes in a more dynamic way.
Like a longer conversation with the problem.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
That could potentially generate the kind of novel experiences needed to build genuinely new reasoning abilities, not just refine old ones.
Okay. So to bring this all together for you, the listener listening in, this deep dive into this really compelling research paper reveals a well, maybe a surprising truth about a technique that's been widely celebrated for making LLMs smarter.
Mm-hmm.
While current reinforcement learning with verifiable rewards, RLVR, is undeniably powerful at boosting performance on reasoning tasks,
It definitely is.
it appears to do so primarily by making the models much more efficient at using the reasoning abilities they already possessed from their initial training, from the base model.
Yeah, it's a major improvement in what they call sampling efficiency, making the model much more likely to produce the correct answer on the first try, which is great for benchmarks.
Right.
But it doesn't seem to be teaching the model fundamentally new ways of thinking or expanding its core potential reasoning capacity. In fact, as we discussed, it might even prune some of that potential capacity in favor of optimizing these specific successful paths it already knew.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating challenge, doesn't it? Building on the paper's conclusions. If current RLVR is largely optimizing within the base model's existing capabilities, how do we design the next generation of training methods?
That's the big question.
What would a paradigm look like that could truly enable LLMs to explore the vast space of possible thoughts, discover genuinely new reasoning strategies, and expand their fundamental capacity way beyond their initial training data?
Yeah.
How do we build models that aren't just better navigators of the known map, but are actually capable of drawing entirely new ones?
Exactly. What does that look like?
Something truly worth pondering, I think, as this field continues its incredibly rapid evolution.